To call the 1950s a tumultuous time in wrestling would be correct, but still you'd be harder pressed to find a decade and a century plus since the advent of the sport where there wasn't an all-out skirmish over talent, territory, and the rising concern at the advent of the 1950s, television time. Historically speaking, I'm Matt Ryan, and this is our look at how wrestling has always been a mess, but specifically a look at the first national wrestling promotion. Or wrestling promotions, as it were. When we last left you, it was Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle taking their mutual talents and turning a territory into two, and then into a near-national concern, leaving the NWA wondering what the hell was going on. Entering 1963, Doyle and Barnett not only had their respective home territories of Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and Louisville for Barnett, and Doyle for Detroit, but also Louisiana, Evansville, Indiana, with former and soon-to-be future NWA President Sam Mushnick, Denver, Colorado, Atlanta, Georgia, in partnership with Paul Jones and Don McIntyre, the former who helped establish the Georgia office in the 1940s, Tampa, Florida, with Cowboy Luttrell, and in conjunction with Big Jim Crockett in North Carolina, and can't forget about San Francisco with Roy Shire. And Barnett would help Pinky George and Mushnick establish the great city of Kansas City, help Balk Estes with talent in Columbus, and lease talent to Windsor, Ontario, Hammond, Indiana, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Omaha, Nebraska. What also helped is that the cities that were in the Barnett-Doyle pipeline were also a few markets of the burgeoning American Football League, looking to take on the established National Football League.
A new league was the least of the NFL's problems. Congress wanted NFL Commissioner Bert Bell to explain why his league should not be prosecuted as a monopoly. So when Bell learned of Hunt's plans, he decided it was time everyone knew about the budding American Football League.
And he asked if he could announce our league in these hearings. Now, he was doing it to get some heat off of himself. They were wanting to know, why isn't the NFL expanding? And so I said, well, sure, you go ahead and do that. And it got enormous attention because Bert Bell, in effect, announced that there was going to be a new league. Well, that was a lot better than having Lamar Hunt announce there was going to be a new league.
The most exciting new development on the American sports scene came to life in 1960 with the birth of the American Football League. Teams at New York, Buffalo, Boston, Denver, Oakland, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Houston.
This league would not only feature college stars of all walks of life, but cast-outs from the Canadian League and those riding the pine on an NFL bench, giving them a chance to become stars. Two of those athletes would be Ed McDaniel and Ernie Ladd. McDaniel would be better known as Wahoo. And here's where he comes into our story.
Anyway, as a promoter in Oklahoma, Leroy McGurk. And I went to school there, and they were looking for an Indian wrestler out in Indianapolis. Big Heart was there, and Don Eagle, and they were all gone. So they wanted an Indian. So I called, and McGurk referred me to Jim Barnett, who was pretty big wig in wrestling all these years. He used to promote Australia, and he promoted Indianapolis then, and so they flew me down to Indianapolis, right out of Alabama, Lexington, Kentucky, really. And they took a look at me, and they liked what they saw, and I went down there and trained for about 2 months.
Expanding on his own words, per Dave Meltzer's obit of McDaniel in the Wrestling Observer archives, McDaniel wanted to get into wrestling immediately after being in the University of Oklahoma, but wait until after the 1961 football season when he was in the AFL, due to a lack of connections. But the rise of fellow Sooner alumni Danny Hodge and Oklahoma promoter Leroy McGurk's understanding of McDaniel's exploits on the football field would lead to him being recommended to Barnett when Barnett was looking for a new Native American star for the Indiana territory operated by fellow Native American Balk Estes. Wahoo would train with Lou Klein for a few weeks and then start working and quickly learn that the $300 to $400 a week he may be making in the ring may be better for him in the off-season than during the regular season as a backup job. That would change as McDaniel's star turn as a member of the New York Jets would come to an end following the hiring of former Baltimore Colts head coach Weeb Ewbank, who would make personnel changes, as they would end up winning their only world championships at Super Bowl III, which may or may not have been the result of some sort of Faustian bargain. Why all the football talk? I could be crass and say it's due to we're recording this during conference championship weekend in pro football, but in reality it plays into a reason why Doyle and Barnett made their world-changing move in the mid-1960s. Another reason was the pro wrestling version of the 5 legitimate business organizations once known as the National Wrestling Alliance. Doyle and Barnett's group had grown to the point in terms of size, scope, and talent it could go stride for stride with the NWA, with Dick the Bruiser, Bobo Brazil, Wilbur Snyder, and the Sheik acting as the top acts along with Shire and Ray Stevens in San Francisco, which became more and more of its own entity as Dr. Leary and LSD would be more prominent in the culture in San Francisco. Both men felt their entry into the NWA would give the legitimacy they needed to truly be a national group, even though you could argue what Doyle and Barnett's AWA were doing could have been a rival to the NWA, but it may have been a war neither man was willing to fight. Instead, they looked to make the alliance their home, but with Fred Kohler still hating both men for reasons not clearly explained beyond possible jealousy, envy, or spite, them getting into the NWA was going to be a tough ask. If you go to mushnick.net or check the link in our description, you'll see dozens of pages of correspondence between Sam Mushnick, members of the NWA, and an Assistant Attorney General, Lee Lovinger, who was seemingly in charge of doing the ongoing check-ins on the NWA to make sure that they were doing good capitalism instead of a bad capitalism. And well, Kohler, Vince McMahon Sr., and Toots Mondt were doing anything and everything in their power to make sure Doyle and Barnett were not members of the NWA. This makes no sense to me, as it would neutralize them and give you access to their talent, but this alliance was made up of guys looking to protect their corner instead of building up an empire. Watch Anthony Barksdale's chess piece analogy from the first season of The Wire to get a better sense of it, or just watch The Wire if you haven't already. Not now, though. Wait until the video's over, obviously. Give me the YouTube revenue or the podcast revenue. Moving on. The heat on both sides would see Florida promoter and a man who was set up in part by the Barnett-Doyle syndicate, Cowboy Luttrell, inform Mushnick that if Doyle and Barnett were not admitted in the NWA, that Mushnick had his resignation on file just in case. Prior to that, though, Vince McMahon would resign from the NWA for the first time just a year removed from being inducted into the alliance at the behest of Toots Mondt, who once again appears in an episode of this show as a harbinger of doom with the slight scent of the OTB, which is sadly nostalgic for me. While Mushnick would implore McMahon to return to the fold, there was a bigger issue surrounding the NWA World Championship, which was around the waist of McMahon and Mondt's top attraction, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. Rogers, born Dick Road in New Jersey, was very much not a popular guy amongst the promoters in the NWA, mainly because he was kind of a dick. This was not necessarily a good thing because even though McMahon and Mondt were associated to Fred Kohler, Kohler was holding on to the NWA presidency aiming to settle scores like when the Barksdales were trying to settle stuff in the first season of The Wire. Again, I implore you to watch The Wire. So you have all of this going on as the Barnett-Doyle drama is unfolding in the background. McMahon was also late with his NWA dues, but with also the percentages he owed to the office, the NWA office for cards, especially ones featuring his world champion. McMahon was playing it fast and loose as he would become frustrated with the situation, especially with the oversight of the federal government and the DOJ acting as babysitter, peeking into everything the NWA was doing. Rogers was a stark contrast to what was being presented previously as your NWA World Champion archetype, with Thesz looked as the gold standard for the Alliance's title. Weirdly though, if you put Rogers in the world of Barnett and Doyle, he would probably fit right into the atmosphere and would have been an amazing asset at the time. If McMahon had taken the title from him and sided with the Alliance, what would have happened if Rogers jumped to Barnett and Doyle's concern, and what happens next after what they do next? But it was a problem because the Alliance at the time were seeing houses dip in smaller markets while bigger markets obviously loved what Rogers was doing. It would also be McMahon's booking of Rogers at home in the Capital Wrestling territory, where the world champion would be working smaller venues such as the Sunnyside Gardens, or when put inside Madison Square Garden would be working tag matches, which was the norm for top guys like Rogers at the time. But to the Alliance, it made him look like he was just another member of the roster that night on the card, which he kind of was for Capital. Oh, the wonders of a traveling world champion. What further complicated things for McMahon was that Kohler was no longer the NWA president, stepping aside for Amarillo promoter and partner of noted anti-Rogers promoter and wrestler Dory Funk Sr., Doc Sarpolis. From there, McMahon would tighten their grip on where Rogers was booked, especially after a run-in the champion would have in 1962 while working for Al Haft in Columbus, Ohio. Haft was in the middle of his own war, as we covered last time on this show, with Barnett and Doyle for Columbus and for Cincinnati at that time, and some say that it was Barnett and Doyle, possibly, or maybe Jack Pfeffer who set this in motion, while other people think this was done on spec, much like when Christopher was shot by those two morons in Season 2 of The Sopranos. It would be Dr. Bill Miller and Karl Gotch, that's right, the god of pro wrestling, who were working for Doyle and Barnett at the time on August 31st, 1962. Miller and Gotch would call out Rogers in the locker room of the Fairgrounds Coliseum, and some shit talk would lead to Rogers not only getting beaten up, but nearly getting his arm broken when the two attackers would slam it into the dressing room door. With his world champion and top draw beaten up, Doyle and Barnett growing their own territory, and Vern Gagne starting up his own promotion after buying into Minnesota around the same time with his own AWA, there was a world outside of the alliance for McMahon, and he was looking to get out. With Cleveland as a potential spot for his worldwide wrestling alliance running through that city, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit, of all places, McMahon was looking to partner with Mont, who'd be the booker, and boxing promoter Larry Atkins. McMahon was finally ready to set the stage for Rogers to drop the NWA World title and for Capitol Wrestling to leave the NWA. On January 24th, 1963, Lou Thesz would regain the NWA World Championship in front of 11,000 fans in the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, and then would take a 2 out of 3 falls rematch just 2 weeks later without the knowledge of Capitol Wrestling fans, who would be told the initial result would not hold up, as a title cannot change hands in a one-fall matchup. No real plan, Mushnick demanding money owed to the NWA, and McMahon just saying, fuck it. He would continue to promote Buddy Rogers as his World Heavyweight Champion. And while no Triple WA would come to form, the McMahon operation would turn into the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which has no real firm birth date. But per Capitol Revolution, written by Tim Hornbaker, Ray Morgan would announce the move on television on April 18th, 1963. While it wouldn't be late December back in 63, it would be a very special time for pro wrestling that April, as not only would the WWWF take shape in New York, what would amount to the final act of Barnett and Doyle in America would play out in Detroit. In the midst of their first real competition since the All-American Football Conference a decade prior, the National Football League and its fairly new commissioner, Pete Rozelle, were facing a well-funded and well-televised aforementioned adversary in the American Football League. The AFL was a godsend to Rozelle's predecessor, Burt Bell, as the NFL was under a similar investigation to the NWA around the end of the 1950s, right around the time Burt Bell died of a heart attack at an Eagles game, setting up a Doyle or Toots Month-like butterfly effect to where we got the NFL of today. Wonder if that'd make a good podcast. But while all of this is going on, both Packers star and Notre Dame legend Paul Hornung and Lions defensive standout Alex Karras were under suspicion of gambling by the FBI. This would lead to not only Rozelle finding out that Hornung and Karras bet on their teams to win, but Karras' bar, the first sports bar in Detroit, the Lindell Athletic Club, or Lindell AC, was a hub for members of the Detroit underworld. Just one day after Ray Morgan explained the concept of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation for the first time on April 18th of 1963, Rozelle, less than 3 years into the job as commissioner, would suspend Karras and Hornung indefinitely, along with a few other players who were wrapped up in the investigation. Back in the world of wrestling in Detroit, gates were down for Barnett and Doyle, but the former quite possibly was wrapped up in a football scandal of their own. Allegedly, Barnett and his partner Lonnie Winter had established a open-door policy for members of the University of Kentucky football team, and occasionally Rock Hudson would visit. These issues, among others, would lead to an NCAA investigation into the school, and you pile on the dropping houses, everything going on in the North American pro wrestling scene, and this, issues were on the horizon, and the need for a jumpstart for Doyle, Dick the Bruiser, and the Sheik would cause them to look to the sports pages to find the jolt they thought they needed. In what accidentally feels like what the LT Bam Bam at Mania 11 story was based on, Karras would not sign a $40,000 deal with Doyle on April 14th before the suspension was official, but did agree to sign on for a match with the fellow, now former NFLer Dick the Bruiser, set for April 27th at the Olympia Arena in Detroit. Looking to bolster the attendance for this supercard that also featured NWA champion Thesz defending against Bill Miller, Dick and Doyle thought the best option would take the most dangerous man in pro wrestling on a trip to the most dangerous bar in Detroit. Okay, so we're going to go through the timeline of the events. First from the Detroit Free Press. This was from Wednesday, April 24th, 1963. And don't worry about other voice guy. He's not going to be here this week. Him and Louis Tillett had some sort of vacation plan to the Adirondacks. Or that's what he told me in some letter he wrote and ran out the door. Lands in jail after barroom. Bruiser loses tag match with 8 police. This is by George Puskas. Dick the Bruiser, that scoundrel of the wrestling world, the villain hated by all the little old ladies, tended his bruises and wounds Tuesday. He carried his meanness, maybe it isn't an act, into Jimmy Buscaris' celebrated Lindell bar Monday night. And when he emerged, it was with 8 policemen hanging on the Bruiser, subdued and manacled at the wrists and ankles. Bruiser cut 5 stitches worth under the eye, spent the night in the pokey, and whoa, that's not all. He faces a jury trial in Recorder's Court next Monday on a charge of assault due to one of the policemen suffering a fractured wrist. It was apparently no mere publicity stunt. The Bruiser wrestles Alex Karras at the Olympia Saturday night, and he had to come to the Lindell at Crass and Bagley to say a few words to Karras. Karras, the All-Pro Lion tackle suspended by the National Football League last week, is becoming a part owner of the Lindell. In the meantime, he works there as a bartender. Anyway, enter the Bruiser. Karras is seated with friends in a booth. Buscaris, who is maybe 5'6", 150 pounds, is tending bar. According to police, the Bruiser, Richard Afflis, directed abusive language at Buscaris and Karras. Buscaris refused to serve him. Bruiser continued his insults, police said, and Karras started to get up. Buscaris urged Karras to leave to avoid becoming involved in an incident. Buscaris then told an uncle, Charles Kelly, to call the police. Then he grabbed me by the shirt front and swung on me, Buscaris said. I ducked and he swung again. This time he caught me on the chin with an elbow. Karras returned to the bar and with several customers moved to break up the fight, and then 2 1st Precinct patrolmen James P. Carolyn and his partner Andrew F. McCulloch came in and tried to seize the Bruiser. Bruiser, whose wild mat antics have made him wrestling's biggest attraction in Detroit, threw both patrolmen across the room. Mahalik suffered a fractured wrist and Carolyn a torn ligament in the right elbow. 2 more patrolmen arrived and were unable to subdue the Bruiser. 2 more came, then 2 more, making it 8 in all. Finally, they put the Bruiser on the floor, handcuffed his hands behind him, and manacled his ankles. Once outside, the Bruiser told the policeman, "I don't want to fight you guys." In the brawl, a TV set and a vending machine were wrecked. Buscaris said he would not press charges. The Bruiser had not been a patron at the Lindell for about a year. He was at one time a regular patron, but had argued with Karras about pro football. While being treated and receiving hospital, the Bruiser explained why he had returned to the Lindell. "Some people sent me word while I was in Texas that Karras had called me a third-rate football player," the Bruiser said. Afflis, who played on the offensive line for the Green Bay Packers from 1950 to 54, apparently referred to a story about Karras' new wrestling career, which appeared in Sunday's Free Press. In it, Karras did not call Bruiser a third-rate player. But in truth, Bruiser never was much, not on the standards of Karras, ranked before his suspension for betting as perhaps the greatest lineman in football. The Bruiser was a journeyman ball player, said the Lion coaches who remember Afflis from his days in Green Bay. The Bruiser, after appearing in court Tuesday morning, flew to Indianapolis. He will return to Detroit Saturday morning. They say tickets are really moving fast at the Olympia. Okay, so this next column is from a columnist. It's not a news piece. It's from Lyle Smith, called "Boy, Did Bruiser Goof, or Did He?" It is impossible to predict what disciplinary action will be slapped on Richard Afflis, 250 pounds of educated grunts who becomes known as Dick the Bruiser on work nights. But he could be in hot water. The guy violated a whole page of our unwritten rule book, claims Omar Muscles McGillicuddy, who wrestles under the sobriquet of John Doe. Muscles ticked off the Bruiser's latest faults. One, in early morning hours of April 23rd, he did of his own free will enter the premises of the Lindell AC and demand a rehearsal with one Alex "Killer" Karras as preparation for their match at Olympia Stadium on Saturday, April 27th. "We never rehearse in public spaces," Muscles insists. "It is our number one rule that we practice in private, usually in the basement of the promoter's house." Quick aside here. What the fuck is... Are we breaking kayfabe or adding kayfabe? What the hell's going on here, boys? When Killer Karras refused to rehearse, the Killer grabbed Jimmy bench-sitter Buscaris, one of the Killer's partners. Since the Saturday match is not a tag team affair, this is also a positive violation of the Amalgamated Wrestlers Association code. Oh, Lyle Smith is a cheeky bitch. "It is unfair to practice drop kicks or airplane spins with your opponent's partner," Muscles said bluntly. Then when the cops came, the Bruiser wrestled 8 of them at once. Muscles shattered at the memory. He really hit the violation jackpot with this one. They could charge him with a double penalty. In the first place, Shorty Mile High Evergreen, the West Coast little person, has applied for a patent on that set. He has been working on it for years. It is his grand finale. 8 cops at once. The Bruiser obviously lifted it from Shorty's repertoire. Just as grievous is the fact that the Bruiser went through his entire routine without making any attempt to sell tickets or even pass the hat. We definitely frown on this free stuff, you know. Oh, hold on. Okay. Those poor mistreated wrestlers. This is from the same column. Miss Gertrude Hatpin Schwartz, who proudly claims she has nicked 37 villains in the last 17 months, was asked her opinions. "The Bruiser is a bum," she insisted. "He's trying to intimidate that nice little boy Alex by invading the privacy of his bar at 1 o'clock in the morning. He even broke up a pool game. It's terrible. Just wait until Saturday night. I'll give him a jab he'll remember." And does Mrs. Hadpin think that maybe this whole thing might have been a publicity stunt to help sell out the place Saturday? "Are you crazy?" she indignantly cried. "That's the way you newspaper bums. You're always taking digs at the wrestlers. They're not phonies. You are. I ought to give you a jab right now." Already looks ahead to the rematch. Promoter Johnny Doyle took the whole thing in hand-rubbing stride. "This looms as the match of the century," he exulted. "It is obvious that my boys are really up for this one. I can hardly wait for the rematch." Doyle did seem a little troubled about one aspect of the unrehearsed rehearsal at the Lindell involving the Bruiser, the Killer, the bench-sitter, the Q-Stick, and friends. "They tell me that one of the things that was wrecked was the television set," Doyle stated sadly. "I can't for the life of me see why they did that. After all, they should know by now what television means to all of us. How could they bite the hand that feeds us? That wasn't so smart." This is from the 24th or the 25th in the Detroit Free Press. Bruiser on carpet. This is by George Puskas. Dick the Bruiser, the terror of the ring, was given a new match Wednesday, this one against Dave Godelski, chairman of the State Athletic Commission. Godelski said he would call Bruiser, Richard Afflis, on the carpet next week to explain his actions in a barroom brawl last Monday night. Bruiser, scheduled to wrestle suspended Lion tackle Alex Karras at Olympia Saturday night, tussled with Karras and customers at the Lindell bar. He was subdued by 8 policemen and arrested. He faces a court trial on an assault charge next Monday. Godelski said that he might fine or suspend Bruiser. "I don't think Karras was at fault," the commissioner told the Free Press from his Muskegon office, "but I want to call them both in. I just don't like this kind of monkey business. Innocent people could have gotten hurt in that fight. This time things have gone too far. Just 2 weeks ago I fined the Bruiser $50 for wrestling outside the ring. Maybe we'll have to get tougher." Godelski earlier was quoted as saying that he might also fine and suspend Karras, who will be making a return to the ring Saturday after 3 years of retirement. "I think now," said Godelski, "that Afflis went out looking for trouble. I'm more interested in him." Godelski said he probably would delay his hearing until after Bruiser's appearance in Recorder's Court at 2 p.m. on Monday. Injuring 2 cops, Karras had no idea if it was a work or a shoot, and now we have a main event in 3 days where the match is booked by The Sheik, who is a dangerous human being when it comes to a pencil. On April 27, 1963, with 10,000 people in a money-losing affair, with Karras and Dick the Bruiser both being promised $4,500, Thesz getting 10% of the house and 5% for the NWA, Karras and Bruiser would finally step into the ring. And now for coverage of the fight, this coming from the Detroit News on Monday, April 29, 1963. Press box column by Doc Green. There was a moment during the Hippodrome of Wrestling at Olympia the other evening where that artist of villainy, Dick the Bruiser Atlas, entwined the throat of Alex Karras in the ring ropes. Routine theatrics transpired with the Bruiser gloating and Karras writhing in feigned agony. Embarrassing, isn't it? Remarked a fellow sitting nearby. It would have been this was normal staging for the spectacle of wrestling, and yet the man's point was well taken. The improbable build-up to this piece of entertainment, the original cry of gambling, the drawn-out investigation by the National Football League, the suspension of the burly Karras, the brawl last week in the saloon in which he is interested, all of it is combined to, albeit illogically, cause a spectator to expect something else. As you have probably heard, the engagement came off in a rather puzzling fashion. There was little or no dramatic nonsense heralding these two into the ring, which seemed a little surprising. No spotlights, no comments over the loudspeaker. The only bit of fluff that was tailored specifically for the occasion was provided by the Bruiser midway in the brief doings, when he knelt down in the position of a football lineman and gestured defiantly to Karras to joust with him. Karras deigned this one. The disappointing crowd estimates range from 6,500 to 10,000 depending on who was doing the guessing. Acted on cue, they cheered every aggressive notion of the favorite Alex and jeered the Bruiser as usual. And suddenly, 11 minutes and 21 seconds later, it was over. The villain was the winner. The performers quickly and quietly departed. Spectators blinked and asked one another, maybe it's the best of three falls, even as the announcer was introducing the next stanza of the entertainment. Embarrassing it certainly was to Karras. The big tackle had more reporters prowling his dressing room before and after the bout than perhaps ever showed at a wrestling match. There was even visitors from Indianapolis. The Bruiser has a hometown too. As a matter of incidental intelligence, he also owns a saloon, so there you are. A trouble was that no one knew what to ask Karras. How do you feel? Good luck. What's new? Beyond hello, there wasn't much to offer. Afterward, there was, do you think you'll wrestle again? I don't know, he said. The travel is rough. I've got an offer of a public relations job that would keep me in town. I don't know. One gentleman in a try for whimsy suggested Alex had been bilk. That's the way my life's been running lately, answered Karras. An emissary from promoter Johnny Doyle arrived and passed Alex his check. He folded it into his pocket. He remarked, well, that's what I came for anyway. Doyle ascribed the disappointing crowd to the fact that everyone thought it was a sellout. Perhaps, but Doyle had expected capacity. No claim is made here to authority about wrestling scripts, but it would seem that if a rematch were in the planning, Karras would have been declared the winner. As a loser, his value is diminished. The brevity of the performance puzzled, but many be explained in a statement by the Bruiser later when asked if he thought Karras might succeed at this profession. Probably, Dick said generously. He knows the moves, he ought to be in better shape though. Without any genuine basis, I suspect that Alex very probably will not journey this way again. And finally, here's an accounting of the event from famous writer and a man who spent some time with the Lions around this time, George Plimpton, from Paper Lion. Nor was the Lions management particularly pleased with Karras' choice of profession during his banishment. For one of his matches, he was scheduled to fight Richard Atlas, a former lineman on the Green Bay Packers, who had moved on to various roles in the morality spectacle of big-time contemporary wrestling. Atlas fought under the name Dick the Bruiser, and his trademark in the ring was a ferocious countenance, usually covered in blood. In fact, some sort of red liquid, cow's blood perhaps, which flowed from a reservoir in a large patch he wore on his forehead. Now, I respect George Plimpton. He's a brilliant writer, one of America's great thinkers. But even going back to the 60s, they thought it was fake blood! Did no one think of a razor blade? Oh, the possibility that they were actually gigging themselves. Good Jesus. A week before the fight, Atlas turned up in Karras' saloon to shout some obscenities in what was thought to be a publicity stunt to promote the match, and probably was until things got out of hand. There was a little person friend of Karras' in the saloon, a 43-pounder named Major Little, whose return fire of verbal abuse finally ignited Dick the Bruiser and a brawl erupted. Police were called, and the Bruiser, who was wielding a pool cue, was arrested into submission by 8 policemen, one of whom suffered a fractured wrist. They were able to truss him up, binding his hands and feet, and then they moved him onto the sidewalk clumsily, like men carrying a large rolled-up carpet, to await the police wagon. A week later, fed with details on the saloon brawl, a big crowd turned up in Detroit's Olympia to watch the fight, the main event on the card, which included Dr. Bill Miller, The Sheik, Kit Fox, Moose Evans, and many others. In the general admission seats, armed with dried peas to wing at the villains, particularly Dick the Bruiser. Once again, Major Little had a fateful hand in the proceedings. From his front row seat, his height restricted his view of things to the wooden underpinnings of the ring. So in the 3rd or 4th minute of the bout, after fruitlessly trying to see what was happening, he clambered up onto the apron and into the ring itself and crouched in the corner, his back up against the ring post for a view that was unobstructed but was certainly close to. Karras up to that point had performed credibly. He had tossed the Bruiser out of the ring 4 times and had been tossed once himself, and he had hit the Bruiser's patch with sufficient force to get the cow blood dribbling down brother. He had been less successful at looking fierce. With glasses off his large professional face, he simply looked puzzled and then dismayed, when the shrill imprecation suddenly rose startlingly close at hand, and he looked up to see his friend, the little person, up in the ring shrieking at the Bruiser. His attention wandered, and he turned, made some shooing motions with his hands. He shouted, "Major, goddammit, get on down out of there!" His back now turned to the Bruiser, who loomed up close, and then, an apparent departure from this script, which usually calls for the villain's defeat, rushed at Karras from behind, grasped his neck in what was called an Adam's apple chokehold. The Bruiser persevered. He got Karras down and pinned him. In the fight, which was for 1 fall, was awarded to him, his hand raised aloft in a rain of dried peas. In the Bruiser's obituary, written by Dave Meltzer, Meltzer would recall an anecdote told by Lou Thesz about that night, claiming that Karras had called Doyle the day before and asked him, "What do you want me to do?" Doyle then called the Bruiser up and asked him what he was going to do, and Bruiser said, "I'm going to beat the shit out of him." Doyle then called up Karras and said, "Just do whatever you can." They did a number on each other, and Alex ran out of gas, and Dick didn't. When Thesz got back from his match in the dressing room, Alex, who'd shared the room with him, was still laying down on the rug. The Bruiser was in the doctor's office getting stitched up, and while the doctor was stitching up his eye, Dick was smoking a cigar, screaming, "Hurry up, Doc! I got some broad waiting for me." With Dick the Bruiser going into business for himself against Karras, and Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder basically doing the same thing in Indianapolis, taking the territory over by force, it seemed like the right time for Doyle to get out of the Midwest. As 1963 turned into 1964, Jack Little, a Melbourne-based TV personality, looked to convince Doyle and Barnett to come to Australia. With no competition, tax laws that benefited outside investors, and a sponsor like Trans-Australia Airlines would not only provide travel discounts, but free travel for the boys. This was the national promotion they've always wanted, just a world away. With their minds on World Championship Wrestling, they needed their wallets to be prepared, even though they might get a potential windfall from the sponsors and basically taking over an entire country. They also had Jim Oates, a friend of Barnett, putting in a sizable investment into the organization. Barnett and Doyle still felt the need to dismantle their empire. First, they'd sell Denver to Dory Funk, who would in turn sell it to Vern Gagne, and in October of 1964, they'd wrap up their biggest and finest sale, as Doyle would finalize the deal to sell to Ed Farhat, the Sheik, not only Michigan, but Ohio, West Virginia, the Cobo Arena, and all their TV contracts. With scandal, their failures, and more importantly, the NWA behind them in America, Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle leave the story to tell a new one in Australia. One we will pick up in Season 2 of Historically Speaking. Next week, we stay in the Rust Belt, but move things up a few years as Pedro Martinez returns to the narrative to try and take over some of what Doyle and Barnett left behind. This edition of Historically Speaking is a production of Ember Media and a part of the Intergalactic Sports Network. Be sure to like, review, rate, and subscribe, and be sure to join us next time. Bye!